Welcome to Marvel Movie Talk, and I am very excited to continue and, dare I say, conclude our conversations here on X-Men 97. It's by the time people are seeing this, the finale will have been a month ago, and some of you are starting to think, enough already. Actually, I don't think anybody's saying that because of how well received the
I
show
hope
was.
not our fans.
Not our crowd. As always, I'm Christian Bladt, and you'll see over there Eric Connor. I almost misidentified you as Eric Zane. That's the problem with doing multiple shows with multiple Erics.
You have another Eric in your life, and I'm threatened by that. I have to admit.
You wish your hair was as good as his. But also with us again is Andrew Deman, who we've talked to before about his book, The Claremont Run, Subverting Gender in the X-Men, and it's sort of disappearing with my my background, but I have mine right here. And Andrew, we've talked to you about how the book grew out of a Twitter series of Twitter posts. I guess it's called X now. Just very briefly explain how I'm going to say how you were able to con the university you work for in studying Chris Claremont's original 17-year run of the X-Men. I was going to say Uncanny X-Men, but boy, he wrote a lot more than that, didn't he?
He did. Yeah. Man, hundreds of issues, literally hundreds.
Yeah.
I got a position that had some research funding available to it, and I only found out about it last minute. So I had like a weekend to come up with a research project. And I was like, I was going to just do Claremont's X-Men. They'll say no. And I had like a whole pitch. And I just literally walked into my chair's office and I'm like, I'll do Claremont's X-Men. And before I said anything, she's like, oh, that sounds great. And that's my origin story.
Are they hiring?
No, the industry is like frozen right now. They're not hiring at any universities, probably for the next 3 years. It's
I'm patient.
Massacre out there right now.
So what Andrew is saying is check back with him.
Okay? Yeah. Weird.
In 2027, when we're talking about the final season of X-Men 97. So I wanted to have you on in addition to all the guests that we've had back on the show over the last few weeks, because I think it's important to kind of look at this series in relation to the source material. And we talked about, and we did a whole episode of Grant Morrison's E for Extinction, clearly shaping episode 5 and sort of the Genosha stuff. But of course, you don't get to that Genosha story without Claremont's Genosha story. So let's sort of reverse engineer this. Were there things that you were like, I'm not as familiar with what they must be pulling from, because anything that's sort of from the Claremont era, you're probably like, oh yeah, I've counted, all the word balloons in this series. And I know how many times Wolverine thought, he had a thought bubble versus Jean, all stuff that's very fascinating to people like Eric and I. And the last time you were on, we were talking about how it's very easy to nerd out. But what did you think as you were watching this show, sort of about how they were really pulling from all over the place?
Yeah, it's a hodgepodge. I don't know. I kind of liked that, the idea of all these different eras of X-Men operating simultaneously. I thought that was a real, actually creative strength. I mean, as much as I'm a fan of the Claremont work, I'm a fan of Morrison's E for Extinction. I'm a fan of some of the like early X-Men stuff that was kind of being referenced. More recent stuff. There was even a couple points where it seemed like they were almost leaning towards Krakoa.
Yeah, well, that's what I'll interject with during that Genosha storyline, and the fact that we think Magneto's dead, and I mean, for now Gambit's dead. I was like, oh, the only thing that they could be doing was Krakoa, and I couldn't believe. I'm like, wow, they're going in on season 1, and as it turns out, they were not. Andrew.
They were not. No.
Yeah,
maybe season 2.
Yeah, and obviously the original series pulls so heavily from Claremont because he'd only just finished. And yes, you have characters that were introduced after him or fleshed out. Cable's not his character. Bishop, doesn't even show up for the first time until a couple months after Claremont leaves. So that series definitely had some of the subsequent work, but for the most part, you were pulling from Claremont's run, for the original series. You did whole Phoenix and Dark Phoenix, week-long storylines. So I imagine that watching that in conjunction with your work would be it would be a lot more point A to point B, right?
Yeah, for sure. Can I point out one nerdy thing?
Please.
You're in the right.
Yeah, on this show, you have to point out at least 20 nerdy things.
Claremont is actually quite integral to Nathan's backstory. He wrote it, a big portion of it, when he was writing X Factor. One of the last things he did before departing Marvel for the first time. He wrote the I forget the name of the story arc, but it's the one where they go to the moon and the Inhumans are there and Apocalypse is there, and that's where Nathan first goes to the Ascani. So there's a piece of Claremont in that, I would say. But I mean, otherwise, the original series credits Claremont, which is cool because the movies don't, which is tragic.
Although he did get a cameo in one of the worst ones. He's watering his lawn in
he's in a couple of them.
The Last Stand, and Stan's also watering his lawn in Jean Grey's Neighborhood. So, but yeah, he definitely gets his moments. But I mean, I've talked to him a number of times. And early on, I mentioned that it was as somebody who was a fan of it, for them to actually put his name on the Dark Phoenix episodes was well, yeah, because it's where it comes from. It's not what usually happens, even in animation. And in the Marvel movies, it'll be a lot of thank you. And it'll be every writer you've ever heard of that probably wrote a Carol Danvers story, for example. And you're okay, well, they got that, but
yeah, I think one of the big historical touchstones for that was the lawsuit against the Superman movie by Siegel and Schuster, which famously caused a lot of bad press for the company producing. I believe it was Warner Brothers.
Yes.
And that resulted in, at least an attention being paid by creators in cinema to the comic book creators for fear of a public backlash. So just thank everybody and you're good. But look at what's still going on. You look at the Hawkeye series, which used David Aya's designs unbelievably flagrantly in their titles and credited Fraction, but not Aya. It's mind-boggling what they get away with sometimes.
Yeah, no, it's definitely one of those things that you don't fault the creators for feeling that way. And look, I mean, sometimes you do have to make a stink. I mean, the fact that Batman is no longer credited as being created by Bob Kane, it's Bob Kane and Bill Finger, That's awesome. And you definitely get things like that, and I'm sure that guys like Ditko and Kirby never lived long enough to feel that they got their due. And you know what? They never really did. It was a lot of Stan out in front. And, but.
Well, it's funny. I was looking recently at the NBA playoffs and the idea of how much money even a mediocre player makes now, i.e. guys on my favorite team, the Sixers. But I was thinking about that even with the creators of these characters who didn't live long enough to see the just sick amount of money that Marvel Cinematic Universe and DC's universe even would make over the years. So it's they were working, almost they were day players, blue collar guys. And then all of a sudden a mad amount of money comes in. And unfortunately, it's removed enough from their work that they didn't get to really see it. Yeah. But the inspiration, the creativity, what they brought to it was there on that screen making the money. So I know I feel bad for the creators of yesteryear because they didn't quite get as big a piece of the pie as they deserved, and that pie got really, really big over the years.
Well, you have your more recent creators, you'll see Dan Slott, who wrote Spider-Man for a very long time. You'll see him credited on projects now as a producer, and you'll see people as consultants. But yeah, obviously the people who are no longer with us or just retired from the industry are not listed as consultants. And my understanding is that Claremont wrote an X-Men script that I believe it's the one that James Cameron was going to do. I mean, it was presented to him, and then I think that one, it was a treatment. That, you know what? Now I'm remembering what it was.
Yeah.
He and Stan had a treatment, and it was more like, yeah, we kind of want to do something different, you know. So, but I feel like you could always get guys like that to at least do a pass on a script. It's like, well, I wrote all these stories. Let me see if I can tie them together. But I think that it is interesting when you start adapting, you know. What were some of the differences in X-Men 97, Andrew, that you were like, oh, this was really cool. I like that they did this, you know, as opposed to where the source material went?
Well, I think the one that struck me really quickly was episode 2. The idea of taking the iconic trial of Magneto and staging it as an allegory for the January 6th insurrection was kind of cool. And like, that was a great way to contemporize an old story and give it new life. That was fun.
It was not subtle, but in a way that didn't work against it. You know, it was like, oh, by the way, just in case you're not getting this, you know, and to have had that as an option, you know, I think, you know, a lot of the parallels, you know, we talked about how Bo DeMeo, who was heavily involved in this season, somewhat involved in the second season, he talked about, and we shared the tweet on this show some time ago, that the early part of Genosha, you know, the happy celebratory part, he was trying to capture the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, which was somewhere that he would go to, and he felt was, you know, a sort of setting up for what comes next, which obviously was horrific in real life, what happened in that nightclub. And so, you know, just sort of pulling from you know, the headlines, as they say. We did E for Extinction on our book club, and the fascinating thing about that story is that it was published before 9/11, because it sure felt like it was inspired by it. So the print version was not, but clearly this one had ties to that. It had ties to the Holocaust with actual flashbacks from Magneto. Talk a little bit about sort of incorporating real world events. You just mentioned January 6th, and sort of having these fantastical in the one sense stories, but grounding them in reality like this show really did.
Yeah, I think there's a really cool parallel there to actually how Claremont cultivated Magneto in the first place. Magneto is a kind of silly Silver Age villain on the surface, right? He's mad. He's really mad. He's got limitless power and all that kind of stuff. Claremont makes him human, I would argue, or humanistic, by incorporating the Holocaust into his backstory. And now all of a sudden, all these horrible things this guy's doing, they have, I mean, not necessarily an explanation, but some sort of validation.
It's not an excuse, but you sort of understand how he becomes this guy that he's yes, you know, to Stan and Jack, he was the guy who started the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. But you know, obviously he's so much more nuanced than that. And we've shared this image multiple times on this show, but sort of giving him this M costume from the original Trial of Magneto kind of was like first of all, terrible costume. That needs to be said.
Except tickets to the gun show are part of that costume.
That's a great point. Yeah, you were able to really see. Yeah. Let's just say not my favorite John Romita Jr. work is that, but it's a signal to people like us, Andrew, that like, oh wait, they've got him wearing that suit. Oh, this is going to be that sort of, I'm going to try to be a good boy Magneto, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and again, I think that is an example of something cool that Claremont did. That's exactly what the show's doing, right? Taking these characters who are associated with sort of a juvenile Saturday morning cartoon. We all loved it, but we've grown up since. And by embedding them with sort of real world pathos and just these feelings of historical moments, it's a great way to age the series up, which is exactly what they did.
Yeah, as we talked about this show week after week after each episode, it was sort of this idea that on the surface, yeah, sure, it's still for kids, but you know, only kind of, you know, whereas like the original one was definitely for kids, and you know, if you love the characters, you could kind of watch along. This was definitely like, okay, the kids would watch this on one level. there's some mildly objectionable language. I mean, it's just not something you would have gotten in the 90s on Fox Saturday Morning. But for the most part, they didn't go. The example we always use is that they didn't go Invincible, the Amazon superhero show. They didn't go anywhere near that stuff. But it was like, oh, this is grown up, but not just because of the mature actions and the violence. It's just the themes felt so much more mature than the original series was ever able to be. I feel like that was probably fairly obvious, Andrew.
Yeah, the depth, they amped up the depth. They were connecting it to reality. They were, exactly as you were saying, exploring very sophisticated themes, and like the portrayal of Magneto, which I really liked in this series, because it does that thing where he's wrong, but you want him to be right, because he's like hovering on that. But again, he's got so much anger and pain that you can see why it's so hard for him to get past it. One of the best lines in the series was a German line in which he tells an about to be dead mutant to just not be afraid. They did great stuff.
And another great line, I believe it's Val Cooper who says Magneto was right. It becomes very apparent that, like, oh yeah, this guy that you all thought was worried for no reason, he was absolutely right. And yeah, I think it's great to sort of have the full Magneto arc in the course of these 10 episodes, which took hundreds of issues of the comic book, sort of the plans that Claremont never were able to see to fruition. And there was also sort of an editorial mandate that he be the bad guy again as they launched the second X-Men title, which, he only wrote 3 issues of. So it's interesting to think about, and, the books, of course, had this sort of that era where he was like Joseph and forgot who he was, and stuff that we didn't necessarily get. But I agree that Magneto was particularly well served in this series. And before we move on from Magneto, Eric, I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on sort of what Andrew's saying about Magneto.
Right. Well, I think one thing that's so great about Magneto is, like, we see he's trying to be good and how hard it is to be good. Like, it's like the limits of being the baby face versus the heel is because what winds up happening is, even though, like, Xavier's always had this utopic view of what things could be, and unfortunately society seldom allows that to happen. The old joke, the old expression, it's why we can't have nice things. And so I think when you watch the show, but I mean, it was also true in the comic, it's like, every time Magneto tries to turn that corner, he gets like pushed back around the corner by the actions of humans. And I think, like, when you watch X-Men 97, and I even unearthed a couple of my old Claremont comics, which are nowhere near as pristine as Christian's. Look at that. Boom. Wow. We didn't even plan that.
No, we did not. Yeah.
Christian's very good. But I think, like, when you look at, like, some of the comics and reading it, like, definitely X-Men 97, though it did change things and took, storylines that took, weeks, months, sometimes even years, and sort of, made it go pretty quick, just a handful of episodes. I think at the same time, though, you still understood how Magneto got from point A to point B and then back to point A. And that idea of, like, even as viewers, you're like, yeah, Magneto was right. The problem is, like, there's a reason, like, if you only follow Charles, unfortunately, this will happen. If you only follow, and Scott, I think, is dealing with this more than anyone, because Scott has always been Charles' greatest student. But the problem there is like, you need to be a little bit Magneto and a little bit Charles in order to really survive and thrive as a mutant. And unfortunately, if you only listen to one or the other, that's not going to work. And that answer lies in between. And that's the beauty of X-Men, it's the beauty of the storytelling.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Scott, because Andrew, I wanted to get your thoughts on sort of his portrayal in this series, and it is vastly different than the original animated series, and really the way that he's been portrayed live action on screen. This is the more interesting, the really more nuanced. Like, in general, Scott Summers is like a Boy Scout. but
Yeah.
there's so much more to it beyond that. What did you think about, to me, some of the surprising things they pushed his character towards? Not as far as maybe some of us thought it might be heading, but there's another season. But what did you think of what we got out of Scott from these 10 episodes?
Yeah, I loved it. Complete character rejuvenation. Maybe to Eric's point, the idea of Scott rejecting Xavier's philosophy, like openly rejecting his philosophy. You were wrong, buddy. You got us all hurt or killed. You're accountable here. That was a great scene, and again, really shows that need for the sort of multivalent approach to morality and ideology that this series is exploring. And then even at like a more basic level, just make him awesome. Make him do really cool stuff. Give him an amazing fight scene. Give him great scenes of leadership. Give him some good quips. Little things like that can really go a long way in terms of rehabilitating a character that I think a lot of people who are fans of Cyclops would say the original series got pretty wrong. And having it be
and the movies got wronger.
Yeah, I mean, James Marsden is sort of always that perpetual, sort of like
cuck.
Yes, for lack of a better term, he is the cuck, because even in the Spider-Man movies, he's like Mary Jane's. He's J. Jonah Jameson's son, the astronaut, and Mary Jane's like interested in him, but she's not really. So he's always sort of that guy. I think the only time where we're allowed to like him is probably the Sonic the Hedgehog movies. Other than that, but I think they're doing much more interesting things with Scott, and that's one of the characters, by the way, that the original voice actor had passed away, but they hired somebody who sounded exactly like him, and I had no idea.
Oh wow!
Yeah, I didn't realize.
I didn't know until I watched. Disney Plus has that Assembled series, so they did one about X-Men '97, and the voice actor who did Gambit in the original is Magneto in this one, and they have a new actor who's Gambit. So I was like, oh, it all. I mean, I knew that like the one that I knew for sure was Apocalypse, who was John Colicos, who was Baltar in the original Battlestar Galactica. I knew he had passed away, but Cable's a different voice. So yeah, but they're like, no, we want you to sound like the old ones, but it's still the majority of the X-Men and the majority of the characters are those voices. And I think having that consistency, Andrew, really does. Look, we've all seen the shows that do the comeback after a long time, and they sometimes work. And there's sometimes the Murphy Brown reboot, and things that just people don't respond to. And what did you think about sort of getting it to kind of look better than animation from the 90s, but not like, oh, it's going to be as great as we could do in 2024, sort of preserving the style, the sound, and the feel and all of that, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, if you want like a really simple sort of concrete example of that, look at the theme song. Theme song was great, notoriously great. I'm going to keep that principle in place. I'm going to modify it just a little bit, give it some updated noises and harmonies, and everyone can enjoy it on that same level. I mean, the series is very committed to that continuity, hence why it's still set in the 90s, right? You see that a lot with the technology they're using. So I think it's again trying to do both. It's catering to this nostalgic audience, but exactly as you're saying, compared to some other reboots, it's very carefully and effectively integrating aspects of modern media in order to, again, age with the audience, because I've seen better animation since the original X-Men series, and even watching it today, even the aspect ratio is alienating. I think you need a little bit of that like glow up mentality. You need like a justification for what we can do now being there. But as you said, you preserve the nostalgia and you create a continuous narrative. It's great.
The other interesting thing from that Disney Plus Assembled on X-Men 97 that I recommend for fans of the show who are going to be waiting a long time for new episodes. They talked about how the voice cast, that in the earlier episodes their performances were big and sort of emulating the style of the 90s, and as they went along they're like notching it back slowly so that it could be sort of you get more I guess, again, to use the word nuanced, more nuanced performance,
Mm.
specifically from Rogue in the later episodes, where she's sort of taking the stand and she's, smashing through mountains and tossing Captain America's shield. And I think that it's interesting to make adjustments for a modern audience, but still capturing the spirit. And it's hard to think of anything that did as good a job. You have, it's only with animation, I mean, it's not the same level of work, but how many times did Family Guy get canceled? But if you watch it in reruns, you would never know, like, oh, this is from that run, and South Park has been on consistently for 27 years now. Now, they don't do that many episodes anymore, but it's like, yeah, but it looks the same. Could they make it look better? Of course. But then the characters don't look right. And I think it's important to take that into consideration, that you're not going to use your full arsenal of Disney Plus budget and what you could accomplish, but like, we still want it to look the way that it always did. You want to see the characters and have them represent, what they were, sort of like the image that I'm now showing our visual audience. It's like, yes, they didn't need to look exactly like this, but I'm glad that they did,
Well, I think, in the X-Men assembled or disassembled, whatever they call it, on Disney Plus right now, one thing that's really great about the behind the scenes is that they talked, like, this thing came out of love, right? This thing didn't come out of cynicism or just from an Excel spreadsheet. Like, there were so many people that still rave about the original cartoon, and how many of the original writers that got involved in the mix on this reboot, or really not even reboot, because it's just a continuation, as you said before, Andrew. And so I think that's a lot of it, is that they respected what made the original one so special. And they had, I mean, there's obviously a lot of new younger writers at the helm, but you could see the new younger writers, mad respect for the older writers that came before them and for the original source material. So you didn't get that sense of a lot of ego, driving the ship. It wasn't so much, oh, we could do this and that, and we could add that. No, they were thinking about, what do we love about watching this? Is a lot of those writers, of course, on the current one were kids when the original came out. So they were watching it on Saturday mornings, and how that shaped their, really, who they are and who they became as artists. So I think that's, to your points, it's like, what makes this show special is because the people behind the scenes thought the original was so special, and so thus they're trying to, like, capture magic and, again, capture lightning in a bottle twice. And that was a real neat trick they did here. I think they did. I mean, I think the show very much is of the now, but is also, the beauty of it is what worked back then too.
Right. And I think that that's what you get in terms of, a product, whether it's live action or animation, when the people involved do love the source material. I mean, we talk a lot about earlier iterations of superhero series, the Super Friends and even Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Those weren't people who love comic books. Those are people who needed a gig between seasons of Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo. They were just like, all right, yeah, I can write cartoons. Let me write this as well. And I mean, that era of the early 90s, when you got not only X-Men, but you got Batman the Animated Series, you got a great Superman series that people don't talk about nearly enough, and even, some others that I don't think are as iconic, but there was a Fantastic Four, there was an Iron Man, and we don't have any of the media we have today without the success. If Fox had gambled on 13 episodes of X-Men as an animated series and it didn't work, I mean, we never would have gotten the live action. I mean, we probably would have gotten a live action movie, but we wouldn't have gotten it in 2000. You know, what do you think, Andrew, about sort of having people who grew up on these Claremont based stories as they were featured and wanting to try to capture that in, honestly, a medium that doesn't lend itself to adapting? Like, you couldn't do, a 17-year-long series where you adapted every issue of Claremont's run. It doesn't translate to animation. Just word count alone is really how there's not enough time in 22 minutes for all that dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the ways I think about what they accomplished in terms of the rejuvenation of the series, I would say that the series plays out like I remember X-Men animated, not what it actually is. Like if I go back and I watch the original G.I. Joe cartoon, I'm like, oh God, this is not great.
No.
I loved it so much, but let's see it again. It's not great. So X-Men 97, it dodges that dissatisfaction, that sort of disillusionment, because it does the nostalgia thing. It connects to the thing in a meaningful way, but at the same time, it's sophisticated enough that it feels as good as I remembered the original to be, rather than as good as the original was. And that's a cool accomplishment in my eyes.
Right. It lives up to its reputation, not just lives up to the actual product, you know?
Yeah, nostalgia goggles, right?
Right,
Well,
exactly. Yeah, I was to bring it back to South Park, as they called it member berries. You know, it's a lot like, hey, hey, remember Wolverine? Yeah. You remember? You know, and doing so much more with it. And what were you going to say, Eric?
What, Andrew, you're bringing up like G.I. Joe, and you know how when you watch it now, it's like, wow, this is not terribly exciting at all, and everyone just parachutes from the planes. I was showing a bunch of years back, still when we had things called DVDs or Blu-rays, if y'all remember those. I showed my son one of the original Super Friends, and there's a plot line there where the villains are going to turn the entire world into bizarros and cheetahs. And so they create a ray that literally turns every human into either a bizarro or a cheetah. And it's literally, you're watching Super Friends go over the entire world fighting several billion of them. And even my son was looking at this as like, what is going on here? And he was little. And I was like, I thought this was cool. Like, but you're right. It's like the nostalgic goggles. And also it was cool at that time.
Yeah.
We've just had so much more, interesting storytelling in the animated medium since then. So, the difference of watching this in 2024 versus watching Super Friends or Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends in the 80s. And not to mention, we were eating cereal that probably should have been illegal in terms of what was in there. So that might have helped as well.
Yeah. But I mean, look, for me, I was just excited to see these characters that I loved on screen. And I'm talking even before X-Men. And then when you get X-Men, you're like, okay, it's going to kind of feel like any of these shows. I get to see the characters I like, and the stories aren't going to be very good. And you're like, oh, no, wait. So the stories are also good. And, I mean, with the original show, it's always important to point out that Fox Saturday morning, Fox Kids Network, let them kill one of the main characters in the second episode. And it wasn't a character that we as fans were attached to in Morph, but it really let you know, like, oh, this is a little different. And it was serialized. I mean, the Julia and Eric Lewald, who were so heavily involved in the creation of the original series, their book is called Previously on X-Men for a reason, because it was so iconic that every episode was like previously on X-Men. And you know what? I needed that, because I'm like, yeah, what's going on here?
Right.
Trying to, let's not have it tangled in my mind with what was going on in the comic books. And I mean, to actually tell these serialized stories, I think that we were all glad, Andrew, that Disney Plus did this on a weekly basis. Like, imagine if all 10 of them were there on, one night at midnight, and some people you knew would have gotten to episode 5 that first night and been like, oh my God, it blew my mind. And so to have it be one, episodic and serialized, but we're all experiencing it at the same time, you don't get that feeling of the way you used to when you'd finish a comic book and go like, I got to wait a month for this. What's going to happen next? So talk about the way that they did it, and how there's probably resistance to that style of storytelling in 2024.
Yeah. I mean, first thing I would point out is that Claremont is actually a big influence on the idea of continuous storytelling in media, including binge watching. That's been acknowledged by several scholars. But you mentioned episode 5. One of the greatest things about X-Men 97 for me in the last few months was seeing the sort of collective breath that everyone had to take after that episode, and like wait for the next week to see how it played. Like, is he actually dead? Yes, he was. But like, just reaction videos and everybody losing their minds over this. And you talk about plot armor with Morph. Killing Gambit was a big thing. So yeah, no, I think it allowed the series to create a culture and a hype that, as you said, is a little reminiscent of the original series in the ways that we used to consume media, except now we've got social media in which we can really share those exchanges with a lot of people.
Right, because when the X-Men animated series aired, when it started, I was in 10th grade. So I was not going to school being like, anybody see X-Men? You know, I watched it with my little sister, and that was who I could talk to about it. I was like, if somebody brought it up, I'm like, I think it's a trick so that I get pantsed and stuffed in my locker. No, I don't even know what that is.
No, I was watching Baywatch, I promise.
Baywatch nights. But you know, and so when you did
much
meet
more
somebody
complicated
who liked this stuff, you know, going to like comic book conventions and, you know, just like finding your people back then was hard. It was a little bit more rewarding though than just kind of going on Twitter and typing in X-Men 97. And, you know, we had Gina Polito on this show. I hadn't talked to her in years, but she was writing about this show. I was like, hey, I know you're busy. Do you want to come on and talk about it? And she was on twice, you know? So last week with your colleague, Laura Grafton, we had
one of your colleagues. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh no. And very excited to talk to her about the new Joker movie, by the way, because of how much she's written about Harley Quinn. Yeah. But in any case, it's the shared experience happens very rarely for scripted content anymore. You'll have like a couple of like top tier niche shows that HBO knows to roll out on a weekly basis. But I don't know, how many shows is it where it's like, oh, hey, did you see, you know, whatever? I'm on season 2, episode 6. I'm like, all right. I mean, I guess, okay. So I can't talk about that. You know, being able to talk about it. Now, yes, there's that first day where it's like, so anybody see this yet? Hey, I'm going to wait till tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm going to freak out. Yeah. And I don't know. I think that's such an important part, Andrew, why these characters are so important to us, because Claremont serialized them. You know, I guess a lot of comic books prior to the mid 70s, you could almost look at them at like procedural TV shows, where it's like, yeah, we know Peter Parker's backstory. Yeah, he'll have a different girlfriend, but it's really about the plot. You know?
Bad guy of the week, the classics or procedural trope.
Right. And you know, it's like, okay, J. Jonah Jameson's going to yell about how he hates Spider-Man. Check. Peter's going to get some pictures that should convince him that Spider-Man's a good guy, but it doesn't. Okay. And then he's going to fight, a top tier baddie like Paste Pot Pete. All right. We'll get that, you know, and just to have it be so involved and, you know, the carrying it around. I mean, I've talked a lot that I started. The first X-Men comic I ever read was Uncanny 176, and Scott and Madeline Pryor are on their honeymoon, and Scott fights a giant squid. It should have felt like the least accessible, least interesting thing that I ever read. And I once tried to make that point to Claremont, and he said, no, any issue is a great first issue. And I'm like, all right, I think you're a little too close to it. But there was like one page of a storyline where Wolverine was trying to figure out something that was going on in Japan or the Morlocks or something. And I'm like, that one page has me want to know what's going on, you know? Yeah. And to have that balance and have it be a format where to have it be a platform where every issue could be someone's first. And by the way, I started with Uncanny 176. It's not like I was able to go back and get 175 and, you know, getting to a comic store. It was years before I read any of those stories. Right. So you just tried to piece it together, and to have it be that complicated. I wonder if you felt like studying his run as closely as you did it have to be more repetitive than like obviously a television show like this would have to be? Did you have to be really repetitive in the 70s and 80s because it's like, this is somebody's first issue? All right, let's re-explain who all these people are.
Yeah, I mean the danger room sequence at the beginning.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And Colossus, who turns blah 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 into living organics. Yes, I know. I've read 100 of these. We can skip ahead.
I have to use my optic glass to survive this.
Yeah. No, and the first time Wolverine says that he's the best there is at what he does, and what he does isn't very nice, is fantastic. But then it's like, it's kind of a perfect way to tell you who he is. All right, he's a mean guy. All right, yeah, let's go ahead and say it again. All right, yeah, and I specifically sort of talking about the adaptation. I do want to talk about Wolverine, who is, of course, one of the I would say the most popular X-Men in terms of sales, interest, and excitement going back 50 years. And there's two things about him that we talked a lot about on the show. And I want to ask your thoughts on something we talked about. Were you surprised how uninvolved he was in so many of the storylines throughout, especially the first 8 episodes? It's not that he wasn't there. He had some scenes, but he was not at the forefront like I think a lot of us expected the character to be.
Yeah, surprised and delighted, because we've seen adaptations where Wolverine and his popularity can exert a gravity over the rest of the cast and the rest of the story that can ultimately be damaging to it, I would argue. So I think sidelining him a little bit makes a lot of sense. I'm not going to be mad if they do some cool Wolverine episodes in season 2, but taking the time to develop the other characters and not just lean into Wolverine's cool factor is brilliant to me.
Well, and Andrew, I'm sorry. One thing I was just going to say too, because Andrew, you'd mentioned earlier, Cyclops, to circle back to him for one sec, they gave him some really cool sort of flexes with his powers that, we've seen in comic book pages, but really not in the movies for certain, and seldom in even the original animated series. And I think, to your point, putting Wolverine to the side, though it did upset our friend David Brody quite a bit. What it did, though, was it made you appreciate everyone else's powers and how, Wolverine's, he's a badass dude. We know that. But the idea of what Gambit can do, and even Gambit riding Wolverine's backs with the charged up blades, that was a pretty cool image. But what makes it cool isn't just Wolverine's Gambit. It's the tandem. It's the, Colossus throwing someone at someone. I think that there was so much, by putting Wolverine aside, not letting him take all the oxygen out of not just the drama, but also out of the action, it enabled them to really use all the other characters to their full extent in ways, again, even the movies haven't really done enough of. It's like Wolverine, Magneto, they're the ones who seem to take up so much of the effect budget on those X-Men films. And you realize Colossus has never been used to a full extent in those films. Nightcrawler got a great scene in X-Men 2. And we'll hit 2, and also the moment when he saved Rogue, which was just one shot, but I loved that moment where he bamfed out of the plane, grabbed her, and bamfed right back. But you're right. It's let the other characters shine dramatically, but also let them shine as action stars, because it is a team effort. And I think that the animated series did that so beautifully by putting him a little bit to the side.
Yeah, and I think it is almost this guy. We do get to see him a lot. He's, he's half of the next Deadpool movie. His name is half the title, So
he has a popcorn bucket.
He's got a popcorn bucket.
Yeah, we don't. We definitely don't need to talk about the popcorn bucket. But the video of the reveal is actually very funny. But be careful, because it has the theme from 2001 under it, which is a licensed piece of music. So you be very careful when you watch it on a stream. But I thought that getting to see him, I think, was the way that they used Wolverine was definitely part of it was a bigger picture, because I agree with you, Andrew. I think we're going to get some really good stories about him in season 2. Sort of clearly he's going to be left on his own. And I think that once again, he'll probably have forgotten a lot of things, but that's sort of the thing that surprises me, that they went so far as to do the Fatal Attraction storyline, where he has the adamantium removed from his bones, and not something that's part of the Claremont run. But I did ask him within the last year what he thought about, I believe Larry Hama writes that issue, but he's like, oh, no, Claremont says that he had thought for a while that there were going to be bone claws under there. He just never got to explore it. So it's not technically part of the run, but it is one of his ideas. Talk about exploring that part of this character that seems so important. It's definitely for, kids and teenagers who grew up reading it. That's one of the coolest things about him, is that he has these metal claws, and taking that away from him just opens up to some really interesting creative possibilities, doesn't it, Andrew?
Oh yeah, for sure. There's a term for it in fantasy literature called thinning, which is the idea of like if you read Lord of the Rings, you're like, this is cool. It's a magical world, but it's actually less magical than it used to be. And if you read Narnia, it's a really cool magical world, but it's actually less magical than it used to be. So it's this really neat technique. Like you would think intuitively that you would want the world to be at its most magical when you tell the story. But instead you have it be diminished a little bit so that you create this sense of like anxiety and tension for getting it back. Wolverine loses this thing that makes him strong, that makes him feel safe and secure, that gives him plot armor. You've made the character vulnerable, which is obviously good storytelling from a characterization standpoint. And two, you've created this intense anticipation in the audience. I want my Wolverine back. I want him to get his claws back. So yeah, no, it's a great long-term storytelling tactic, as well as just a really dramatic and traumatic thing to have portrayed on screen.
Yeah, and that was one of those ones where when we were doing our show, reacting to that episode, the way that it ended, we were all more than a little surprised. As like, wow, they really did go there, and it's surprising for how much they did show. I think it was wise to start the next episode as sort of after, let's not show more get ripping out. That is where you get into, like Invincible territory, which we
30 minutes real time of it might have been a bit much. Yeah,
a little bit. Yeah, no, exactly. It might have been a little bit much, but I want to sort of touch on one of the reasons that I'm sort of wondering that they've got stories planned for there. Do you think that could possibly be part of the reason why, speaking of you want your character back, Storm in this series she was not without her powers for very long. And I kind of wanted to see that exploration. I think that that's such a fascinating iteration of that character. And the only thing I can come up with is like, they're probably going to do stories in season 2 about Wolverine being less than who he wants to be. So maybe it would be redundant if they did it with Storm first, but I was still disappointed. What do you think about all that, Andrew?
Also disappointed. Yeah. Again, so many things I will praise this series for. Their handling of life, death, less so. They sort of isolated the Fall of the Mutants material rather than the much more long-standing, much more character-based material that you get sort of post-life death. I would have loved to have seen that be cultivated more. I was saddened by those 2 episodes. Everything else, right on board for, but Life Death's a real favorite for me too. So
go ahead.
No, I was just saying, like, we had talked about this previously on the Blackcast. We had talked
Marvel
about
Movie Talk. That's what
Marvel Movie Talk, as featured on Geekscape, a subsidiary of
Thank you.
Geekscape Worldwide. We talked about how they sped past it. Like when they had that moment, I think a lot of us who knew that storyline were like, "Oh, great, they went there." And I even the Life Death. So we're talking Uncanny X-Men 186. Like the opening image. Apologies, it's a little hard to see here, but it's her depressed in bed.
Yeah.
And that goes on for many panels.
Well, that's a double-sized issue.
And and an ad for Buckaroo Banzai, of course.
Do you think that's why she's depressed? She's
Maybe.
like,
she read the box office returns. She's Peter Weller's agent. What made Storm such a fascinating character. And she's like, it's funny, like Cyclops, I think, is Christian and my sort of like we're always championing him, but every one of us in Marvel Movie Talk, a subsidiary of Geekscape, loves Storm. And Storm is another character who they had an Oscar winner in the role and they still didn't get much out of it. And that's a real shame. And I hope when they reboot it, they first are like, all right, who's our new Storm? Because her story with Life Death and how she was she was in charge of the X-Men without powers. Like there's so much to that, and I agreed, Andrew. It was just, I think all of us were kind of sad they just let that thing get solved in 2 episodes. I mean to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if the season had ended, it still would have, and then she got it back like in the finale, it would have felt like, okay, that wasn't long enough, but at least they explored it. It is a minor criticism. It's just very disappointing because you can't put that genie back in the bottle. You've now told that story.
Right.
And when they first announced the titles of the first 10 episodes of this reboot, this sequel, you're like, wow, there's a Life Death and a Life Death Part 2. I can't believe that they're actually telling that story, and they did tell it, but not to the extent that I think some of us were expecting,
Yeah. There's a symbolic shortfall there too, because Life Death is about depression. Right.
Yeah, right.
And the comic book exploration of it is this really complicated, long-standing process of, surrounding yourself with people you care about, finding your identity, redefining yourself, and then maybe you'll be okay. The TV series was, you just got to get over it.
Yeah.
And be a goddess again. And I'm like, is that the best message we want to send?
And don't worry about it.
Be depressed.
Go to sleep. You'll be fine.
You lost your powers, Aurora. Walk it off. Come on. Yeah. It's like it's like the high school basketball coach in a movie that just it's take a lap, but I'm really take another lap. Like, all right, I don't know that that's really good.
And this came out when I was 10, I think. It was like 1984.
86, I think.
Oh, it's 86? Okay.
I could be wrong. I could be wrong. You know what? Either way. Yeah, I think it is 84, actually.
Young enough that definitely the idea of reading about depression wasn't necessarily something I'd done much of, I don't think. I wasn't really reading much Sylvia Plath back at that young age. So
good for you, by the way.
That's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I'd be worried if you were. Yeah,
I'm a huge Bell Jar fan, right? But
hey, Mom, can I clean the oven? No, stop it.
We called ourselves Bellies back in the day. But I think with this, you're right. It's like it was not just about depression for an issue. She was dealing with this for how long was that run, guys? Was it like a year?
Over a year.
Yeah. So you, by the way, you're 100% right. It's October 1984 that it's published.
Boom.
So the first part is Uncanny 186. And then the sequel is 198. So yes, it is exactly 12 months of storytelling. And she doesn't get her powers back in Life Death 2. In fact, she learns to be a better Storm without it. And again, that's what we always talk about, sort of the beginning of the mistreatment of Cyclops, the fact that she handily wins the right to lead the X-Men when she has no powers against Cyclops, who promptly leaves his wife and newborn child to go hang out with his ex-girlfriend. And we can't fault Claremont with that because he fought tooth and nail. He did not want Jean Grey to come back. And he did not like any of that storytelling, but I a lot of, the book that we want to make sure that people who enjoy conversations like this, and yes, I will say nerdy conversations, but we're on a show, we're on a network called Geekscape. So what do you want? Why are you here? So obviously, Subverting Gender in the X-Men is the subtitle to the Claremont run. And obviously it's easy for, men who look like us. That's why I always wanted to get some female perspective, like we did last week, on how they thought. I felt like the female representation was very strong and very well done in this series, which is comparable to Claremont's X-Men. How do you feel it measured up? I know you're not going to have the stats like you do in the book, Andrew, but just your sort of general feeling. Do you feel that they did a good job with representation?
Yeah, I do. I think you see that in the centralization of Rogue, first and foremost, a character who's in a love triangle and kind of chooses both. A character who is put through horrible trauma and doesn't decide to take the heroic way. She decides to execute Bolivar Trask. Like little things like that, like the great moments, the great line in the first episode, Storm giving the forecast, emphasizing her power and all that kind of stuff. Even the sympathy for Madeline as a character, which is something I love from the comics so much. I thought a lot of that was coming across too. She wasn't just this empty villain. And yeah, it was great.
Yeah, no, I think they did a good job on that. And one of the things that we had to highlight, of course, was this inclusion of Morph as a non-binary character. And, Bo DeMeo coming out and blatantly saying, is like, just in case you didn't get it, he's telling Wolverine that he loves him as Jean, but he does feel that way, or they do feel that way. My apologies. And I just thought that, and I had said this on a previous episode, whoever thought about, oh yeah, that guy or that person who can change shape and gender and whatever. Yeah, they're probably going to literally be gender fluid, because his body is fluid. And it's such a simple idea. And I was like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think that, anytime you put a little bit of a toe into some water and you start to do a little bit, there are people that sometimes were like, oh, we'd like to get more, but there's another season. I wanted to get your thoughts on Morph in this season before we start to wind down.
Yeah, I think it's good. I think where Morph is carrying a trajectory from Claremont would be obviously Mystique, and the things that Claremont wanted to do with that character, but was, as mentioned by editorial, not allowed. Just the idea of, again, Mystique was supposed to be Nightcrawler's father in a relationship with Destiny.
Right.
And several people, including Ann Nocenti, said, no, you're not allowed to do that. So I think Morph picks that up.
Right. And I think that to the point of, telling these stories in the 80s and, selling them on newsstands and having the Comics Code Authority slapped on it is a huge difference from the stories you're able to tell right now. And I think that, look, just because, you have to always look through that glass of, I mean, it's funny though, because what you're saying, it's like, if you read scenes with Mystique and Destiny, it's like, oh, it's all still there. He just can't be as upfront about it. I mean, as someone who studied the run, I feel like I should defer to you a little bit, but my memory, anytime I've gone back and read stuff, I'm like, oh yeah, no, it's definitely there. They're just not like, I don't know. They're not like holding hands and skipping stones as
they raised a child together.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a fantastic point. And I think that the thing that they were able to get right with Claremont's X-Men, with the new X-Men that are obviously, first created by Len Wein and Dave Cockrum, was just this idea of like, yeah, they look like everybody. They're, I mean, to have a Russian on the team in 1975, I think is lost on a lot of people. To have a German even at that point, it was interesting. And that, so I think that for all the good that they were allowed to do, and you've seen a lot of Claremont's notes, I'm sure that you're well-versed on like, people have no idea how much further it could have gone if he'd been allowed to, right?
Oh yeah. The archives have a lot of interesting ideas. I mean, maybe the easiest and most shocking one is he really wanted to kill Wolverine.
Yeah, he's talked about that. Yeah,
several
and
times.
So when he did that, I think that was that X-Men Forever, or that's not Extreme X-Men. Anyway, he had sort of that series he did where it picked up after the X-Men Volume 2, number 3, and it's like, here's where that story should go. And within like 5 issues, Wolverine was dead. So.
Yeah.
But you don't really focus on some of those ancillary things or his subsequent runs on Canny, right? Your focus has primarily been that initial 17-year run, right?
Yeah, just because we were doing quantitative stuff, you have to limit your sample and you have to clearly define it. Yeah. So the easiest way to do that was just, I'm going to do Uncanny X-Men number 97 to 278, I think it was.
Yeah.
And no annuals, no sort of supplementary materials, which is tragic because some of the really best stuff is in the annuals. But it worked.
Yeah, no, I know. And there was a point where there was so much ancillary stuff. There were the annuals, there was the X-Men Alpha Flight, there were X-Men and the Fantastic Four, X-Men and Avengers.
Micronauts.
Yeah. Well, X-Men and the Micronauts is not as important as some of those. And I don't know if you've cracked open X-Men Micronauts anytime recently, Andrew, but it it is a very problematic portrayal of my favorite character, Kitty Pryde, who is 13 and a half in the time. And she's, well, they really sexed her up a lot. And yeah, no, I know. And it's like, I get it because, you know, creepy boys like me were supposed to be buying it. But at the same time, I'm like, there's probably another way to do that.
And you're now the dad of a daughter. And none of
well, there's that too.
okay.
Yeah. No. I just was like, I don't know. I think she could probably be in a one piece. I don't think she needs such a skimpy bikini, but you know, what do I know? That does bring me to the fact of my greatest disappointment in all this adapted X-Men stuff is the fact that Kitty always seems to be in the back seat because you know, just because of the time that the original series was made, Jubilee was filling that role as the young sort of new member figuring it all out. And you know, we talk about the pilot episode Pride of the X-Men that had come out just a couple years earlier. I mean, her name was in the title. And by the time they do this series, it's like, well, let's take a look at Jim Lee's X-Men. Okay, that's everybody who's in this. And we didn't get Kurt until later in that show. And we haven't really gotten Kitty. And I don't know. I'm always holding out hope that we're going to get her because as somebody who studied that run, I mean, she's such an essential part to Claremont's run, isn't she?
Yeah, she's the moral consciousness of the entire team. She's the lens through which a lot of the philosophy is articulated in her time there. So yeah, no, I would even be okay if like we gave Jubilee in X-Men 97 more Kitty beats, and more of that presence.
Yeah,
we didn't even get that.
No, I do think that she comes off better and people responded better to Jubilee in 97 than the original series. You know, but yeah, I think that they gave her, you know, it's sort of like we were talking about with Morph. Oh, this was a great step. Let's hope that they do more with her in subsequent seasons. But it's crazy the way this season ends, Andrew. Like, I know that the story beats that they're touching on are really post Claremont, but I mean, you know, so dealing with Apocalypse in ancient Egypt and the clan is a skinny in the future, getting to see Rachel Summers, who was another one of my favorite characters. It's just like, that season's going to be crazy. I can't wrap my head around what season 2 of the show is going to be like. Can you?
No, I think the sentiment that a lot of people expressed was, what are you saving? You know what I mean? Like you're trying to hit all of the main stories really, really quickly in rapid succession. So no, I'm excited. I'm excited to see what they can do because they earned my trust with a really, really good season. And I'll just be here crossing fingers for Outback area.
Yeah, I would love an Outback stretch. Maybe season 3, Krakoa season 4. You know, let's take some big swings. And I there was definitely some of those feelings, you know, throughout the season that it's like, man, they are cramming so much into here. They touch on an Inferno Madeline Pryor story that, you know, probably didn't need to, you know, be dozens of episodes like it was in the comics, but I was like, oh man, it was just really, you know, it was they kind of left us wanting more, but I guess that's the design. And at the end of the day, Andrew, I mean, there are 60 years worth of X-Men stories to pull from, so I guess they'll find something to do. And look, they're about to the ongoing monthly, the Krakoa era is officially ended, and you've got, you want to talk about representation and inclusion. You've got Gail Simone, the first female as the solo writer for an ongoing for Uncanny X-Men, for the X-Men book. I know that it's on its like 8th volume and it's going to be a new number 1, but it's, you know, in 700 issues, that's not what's happened. So I think that the one thing that Marvel Studios does is it keeps an eye on what's going on in present day comics for the movies. And it's like, yeah, let's use these characters. So I'm not that worried, but I just can't imagine what they're going to do, Andrew.
Yeah. Again, as you said, they have a massive portfolio to work with. And I think the real strength of the MCU, particularly in the early years, was having people who understood which stories to mine. Yeah, which were the good ones, and not even just the good ones, but which ones could work cinematically, right? I think 97 was doing a little bit of that as well. It has a good sense of curation and selection, that the people who are doing it, they've read the comics, they know where the gems are.
Yeah. For me, there's always the hope that I'll get to see Kitty Pryde in season 2. You're hoping for the Outback. Is there anything else that you're like, I bet they could squeeze, this or that in there? I mean, they're setting up Gambit for, being a horseman of the apocalypse, which is a crazy, thing to run with on what is essentially a kid's show. Is there anything that you're like, it probably won't fit in there, but here's what I hope they squeeze into season 2?
So they were completely set up for this, so I don't think it's going to happen because they went a different direction. But X-Men Volume 2, issues 1 to 3, the last thing Claremont wrote as part of his original run, that's a really good Magneto story. A story where he's asked to be a villain, and Claremont makes him a villain technically, but he's absolutely the hero of that story.
Right. No, I know when he's bringing Asteroid M to Earth, I also thought we were going to do that. So I can't imagine. And Eric, I know we've talked about it before, but as we continue conversations about this show, is there anything that you've thought about? Like, obviously we'll be watching that show every week whenever it comes, and we'll be excited. But is there something you're holding out hope for that you're like, oh man, I want to see this story, this character? I'd like more Starjammers personally, now that I think about it out loud. But what about you, Eric?
I think Cyclops hitting that breaking point and suddenly getting a little bit more into the Magneto waters would be fascinating. But also, too, you brought up Kitty Pryde. And so, to me, the Kitty Pryde-Colossus relationship, that was something I always enjoyed in the comics. And, talking about what they did with Jubilee, which was really kind of great in X-Men 97, was her as, like, a mentor. Considering like she was it the pilot of the original that they first got her, and so now Sunspot is hers to an extent. I think Kitty Pryde was always such a fascinating character, and back the one thing X-Men Last Stand did right was casting then Ellen Page, now Elliot Page, of course,
now Elliot Page,
as Kitty Pryde, because like Ellen Page was such a wonderful presence in that film, and really like it was didn't have a big role but so much complexity. She was just such a wonderful actress too, and so I think like if they can sort of find that kind of human quality of a character like a Kitty, and maybe you guys are right, maybe it's about using Jubilee and allowing Jubilee to have some of that because she is close in age, and the way they've handled her is similar to that, but I could use a little bit more of that, someone that felt just down the road from being a regular teenager. I think that's something that's really where they could go, because that's so much of what makes X-Men great. It was a school. There were young people, and I would hope they don't lose that. But I'm curious because they've burned through a fair amount of story engine. Good news is there's a good 5 to 6 decades worth of story engine, but so I trust, and they, as you guys said, they've earned our trust. This has been, I think, not just great comic book cartoon storytelling. This is great storytelling. This is a good TV series, and something that hopefully the rest of the Disney properties, all 1 billion of them, can take a lesson from, is like how you can make these stories work as television rather than just a morphed movie, trying to make it cinematic when TV does work differently, even in a streaming age.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and to that point, obviously, as a TV show, look, there, in the course of the past year, there have been plenty of shows that I'm excited to watch every week. Star Trek: Strange New Worlds is way up there for me. Nothing compared to I can't wait till basically, I can't wait till I drop my kids off at school so I can finally watch this. So like that anticipation, nothing is compared. I mean, David Tennant comes back as Doctor Who, and it's a fascinating idea, but at the same time, it's like, I kind of want to know what's going on in Genosha, So it managed to be that like excitement level, that appointment TV by being a weekly show. Disney Plus has done that very well. They don't really do the binge style. They did it with Echo, as we talked about, but I think that was not necessarily the way those stories were constructed. But I think it shouldn't be undersold that even though this is animated, this is indeed just great TV. And I don't know, Andrew, we talked a lot on the show about it's hard to think about something that's come out from Marvel Studios that there's been this kind of overwhelming support and appreciation for since Avengers Endgame. Like, I don't think anything they've done since even comes close, you know? People.
Yeah, I think if you want to take it a step further too, like, this show is polarizing. It is contentious and confrontational in ways that, frankly, a lot of the MCU has never been. So the idea that you could, I don't know, push that hard and still be universally beloved, I think is another testament to the quality of the series.
Yeah, I think you're right, and obviously these character dynamics work so well, and I think that yes, they did Civil War in the MCU, but Cap and Tony were friends before too long. It didn't really last for all that long for what we see, and that's a problem with a film universe, is that you only get so many hours to tell your story, and it spreads out over years. So you're really like, we got to move this along. So even a 10-episode animated series where the episodes are about half an hour, we get so much more time to play in the proverbial sandbox. Andrew, before we go, I wanted to mention, and I had sent this to you in an email, you're up for an award for your Claremont work, right?
The book is nominated for the Eisner Award for Best Scholarly Book.
Whoa.
We're going to lose hard, but we're nominated. So
where are the ballot boxes we could stuff?
They're online.
As all elections in America.
Need a good hacker, a really good hacker.
Yeah. Well, let's just say I know some people in Chicago. So
okay, nice. Perfect.
But no, obviously to get that kind of recognition, obviously, like the Eisner Award, for people that maybe don't know, I mean, it's the Emmy, the Oscar of, comic books. And I'm sure that when you, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, when you came up with this idea sort of over a weekend, expected them to say no, you didn't think, well, I'm going to get nominated for an award for this. And yeah.
I thought I was burning my career for this.
And you get to hang out with cool guys like us.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, I'll win.
That's the realize there.
Yeah. Thank you. So obviously the account, it's the Claremont Run, right? Is on X/Twitter and you still update that, but you're also doing other things comic related. And I wanted to give you a moment to tell our audience about that.
Oh yeah, thank you. I'm also doing another social media project called Sequential Scholars, which is kind of what the Claremont Run does, but with whatever comics we feel like talking about in any given month or week. So that you can find as well, just looking up Sequential Scholars.
Yeah. So, I'm always glad to see that, when you sort of closed the metaphorical book, not the actual book on Claremont Run, I wasn't sure that there was still going to be a lot of posts and things, but you just had something the other day. So I'm glad to see that it's still in there, because I eventually just wrote to you because it would be these really long threads. And I'm like, was fascinated by, how in depth it went, not realizing until I got the book, when it would be things like, counting character, thought balloons, word balloons, storylines, who's featured on the covers, all the stuff that, going back to me in 10th grade, I'd have to pretend I didn't care about, but was very excited to be able to be like, oh, look at that. Look at how much, how much Wolverine there was compared to Storm. I think we knew it, but then when you actually see the charts. So, Andrew, it's always wonderful to chat with you, especially about these stories. I hope that before too long, we're able to be talking about a great X-Men live action movie that came out of Marvel Studios. Much like the original series led to us getting the film universe to begin with, I do hope that they've learned from the way that people have responded to this and take their time with whatever the X-Men film is, however you want to introduce those characters. I mean, there's a lot of questions from that post-credit scene in the Marvels where we see Beast, obviously voiced by Kelsey Grammer, as he was in the earlier Fox films. So they have a plan. I just want it to be a good one, you know.
Yeah.
And I used to be able to say like, oh well, the MCU hasn't let me down yet. Well, they've started to let us down a little bit.
Yeah.
But I feel like everyone knows what a valuable property this is. Yes, financially, but also just connecting with your fan base. And we've been done wrong, haven't we, Eric, with some of these X-Men movies?
Well, and they've also struck out on the most famous, most remarkable plotline ever, the Dark Phoenix saga. They've missed it twice.
Yeah.
It's like striking out a T-ball. It's really hard to do.
But they've managed to do it, yeah.
Yeah, but they've also, we've gotten so many glimmers of what the X-Men cinematic universe could be. X-Men 2, First Class, Days of
Future Past, I felt like was it's one of those
fabulous.
things where a lot of those I think X-Men 2 is the closest to perfect that they did, and that's essentially God Loves Man Kills, sort of loosely. But yeah, and Days of Future Past, it's when they take the big swings at stories that aren't Dark Phoenix, they at least have managed to deliver something. So yes, there's a lot of potential. I think that the people involved, as they found with this show, if you love the characters, we're going to see it on the screen, right, Andrew?
Yeah, I think Marvel clearly recognizes that, and I would argue X-Men 97 is testament to the fact that they're recognizing that.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, wonderful to get to chat with you again. Eric, let people know where they can find you.
Well, I am now the 5,500th follower of Sequential Scholars over on X. So thank you for not blocking me yet. I'll try to keep my responses appropriate. You can go find me, Count Eric Connor, hanging around on the dark shadows of X and the light of Instagram. Feel free to say hello. I would love to see you guys on
as we were talking last week. What about Threads? Are we trying to make Threads happen, or is that ship already sailed? Yeah,
it's a loose thread at best. Yeah, no, it's gone.
Andrew, do you even bother posting on Threads or?
No, I thought about it and then I didn't.
Yeah. And right there is the summary on Threads. That's the way.
Then I went to Tim Hortons instead, basically, right?
Yes, there's nothing wrong with
double.
You go to get a bunch of those Timbits. I mean, come on, now you're talking now you're talking things that make sense. In any case, we appreciate everybody who has joined us, all of our regular panelists and all of our guests. We are going to be back in July talking about some other Marvel related things. We're going to have some guests on. So follow me on Twitter /X at Christian DMZ. I'll let you know when you'll get to see those. We'll have some new guests on. And by the time people are seeing this, we're almost a month away from Deadpool and Wolverine. And if we did 3 episodes on the Marvels, you can count on probably 5 episodes on Deadpool and Wolverine. Very excited for that. Do you have high hopes for that, Andrew, that film? Or, getting Hugh Jackman back after he'd said that, every time he thinks he gets out, they pull him back in. It's hard to not be excited for that film.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And again, like the last 2 Deadpool movies were brilliant, subversive pop culture media portrayals. So, yeah, love seeing Wolverine integrated into that. Should be amazing.
Yeah. And you can, of course, subscribe to my personal podcast, The Blattcast, BLADTCAST. We've been doing some movie-centric episodes recently. We talked about the most recent Planet of the Apes episode. I did an episode on RoboCop with Doug from Good Times, Great Movies. And keep the kids out of the room, but we actually went through Caligula. Yes, that version of Caligula, because I had never seen it before, Andrew, and someone recommended it. She wanted to do an episode on it, and I'm like, yeah, I'll watch it. And wow, it's everything that I thought it would be, and so much more. So check that out. In any case, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody. We will see you soon here on Marvel Movie Talk. But until next time, as the great Stan Lee would say, Excelsior!